Today, Apple's share of the U.S. performance smartphone market exceeds 70%.
Google on Wednesday said it will defend itself vigorously against the antitrust
Government
lawsuit.
run by the rich and the powerful is proceeding rapidly.
We live in a world of quiet monopolies, duopolies, oligopolies, wallopolies, xylopolies. Okay, I made those last two up, but the increasing concentration and consolidation of corporate power. And I say quiet because no one really wants to make it made plain. It's bad for business, but you find them almost everywhere you look. Quite literally. Do you wear sunglasses? Go into your local store and there's the appearance of choice, right? Oakley, Ray-Ban, DKNY, Sunglasses Hut, Prada, Chanel, Ralph Lauren. Well, peer a little closer and you'll find they're all made by one company. Luxottica controls 80% of the market. Going on a trip? Well, where do you start? Hotels.com, Trivago, Booking.com, Kayak, Expedia, HomeAway, Priceline, Travelocity, Hotwire, Orbitz, plenty of choice, right? Well, they're all owned by two companies, Expedia Group and Booking Holdings. Oil, sugar, banking, tobacco, all concentrated into a handful of corporations. How about the media you consume? If you're in the US, Comcast controls 70% of the media market. What about food? Do you need to eat to survive? Well, just four companies control 80% of the beef packing market, for example. The Body Shop, Nescafe, Aero, cat food like Felix, and hundreds more brands, all of them owned by Nestle. What about accountants? Well, since the 70s, they have consolidated into four big corporations in America. Publishing houses, air travel, big tech. Thinking about maybe dying one day? Well, mergers in 2014 meant two companies now control 82% of the coffin industry. Everything is getting bigger. We live in an age of the gigantic. The state, bureaucracy, the military, surveillance technologies, big tech, big business, multinationals, corporations. Things have grown to historic sizes. But the assumption is often that this is automatically bad. The left fears big business, for example, and the right fears big government. But if big is automatically bad, then why do we allow getting big at all? What are the benefits of getting big, and what are the risks? I think these are some of the most important questions of our age because we don't really understand them. We don't really understand how the question should be framed, what the conditions of it are. We often don't really think clearly about what bigness means. As the historian Charles Geist has written, that, quote, the entire period of American capitalism since the Industrial Revolution has been an unrelenting trend towards consolidation. And as we'll see, that idea of consolidation, of concentration, the authority to control the elephantine growth of modernity and modern institutions and modern technologies, is a story about totalitarianism too. It's not alarmist, as we'll see, but a warning sign of where things might go. You can't understand monopolies without knowing something of their history, because the origin of the criticism against them was not one necessarily of corporate power per se, but of royal, monarchical power. I don't want to go over this too much again, as I covered it in How Capitalism Conquered the World, only to say that granting an exclusive monopoly on trade was a traditional part of a monarch's privileges, their rights. The monarch could and would sell, grant, loan the exclusive right to trade in tea, for example, to one single company in the British territories, in the British Empire. Thomas Paine described England as cut up into monopolies in things like coal, windows, bricks, iron, tea. The list went on. As free commerce became more accepted as something that could in itself drive growth and innovation, this idea of exclusive monopolies was challenged. This happened at the beginning of the 17th century in England, in a famous court battle over whether Queen Elizabeth I could grant a monopoly on the manufacture of playing cards. It was said she was worried about her subjects wasting time playing games and gambling, but the most famous lawyer of the period, a man called Sir Edward Coke, wrote that the Queen could not suppress the making of cards within the realm, and that manufacture cannot be suppressed but by Parliament, nor a man restrained from exercising any trade but by Parliament. One member of Parliament of the period said that, "I cannot conceive with my heart the great grievances that the town and country which I serve suffereth by some of these monopolies. It bringeth the general profit into a private hand, and the end of all is beggary and bondage of the subject." In the 18th century, the economist Adam Smith, famous for his defence of a free market, of course, actually warned against what he called the wretched spirit of monopolies. He believed that, quote, "people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in conspiracy against the public, or in some contrivance to raise prices." Smith points to something that we'll soon turn to and see more evidence of, that you can't ever really know. Whatever your legislation is, whatever your laws are, whatever your culture is, what goes on between two people at a private dinner table. Monopoly had become a byword, a concept, a thought experiment for unjust authority and control, which, when combined with a similar fear of the oppression of religious beliefs, motivated many to leave England for America. This anti-monopoly view was baked in quite literally to the ideology of the Pilgrims, and so many of the first legal codes and small constitutions banned monopolies entirely. The 1641 Massachusetts Body of Liberties, a set of laws declared by the colony, said that no monopolies shall be granted or allowed amongst us, but of such new inventions that are profitable to the country, and that for a short time. Maryland's 1776 constitution, a little bit later, of course, said that monopolies are odious, contrary to the spirit of a free government and the principles of commerce, and ought not to be suffered. Similarly, North Carolina said that monopolies are contrary to the genius of a free state and ought not to be allowed. So, just 3 examples there of how widespread this aversion was in the American colonies. This aversion to monopolies was one of the main causes of the American Revolution. While Britain had granted fewer monopolies since that case in the early 17th century, there was still a widespread belief that commerce had to be controlled, especially within the British Empire, so that wealth, which most thought of as a zero-sum game, didn't flow out to competitors like France. So the most obvious monopoly was the East India Company's on tea. Americans had to import British tea only, and the British taxed it. So there was widespread smuggling, a huge economy of smuggling all along the coast of America in lots of these products that were taxed by the British and the British Navy and their inspections. Again, monopoly then, to them, equaled unjust authority. And so, at the outbreak of the American Revolution, 342 chests of East India Company tea were jettisoned into Boston Harbour. Thomas Jefferson went as far as arguing that the Constitution should include the freedom of, quote, commerce from monopolies. Thomas Paine said in Common Sense that there shall be no monopolies of any kind, that all trades shall be free, and every man free to follow any occupation by which he can procure an honest livelihood, and in any place, town and city throughout the nation. One American jurist said that Queen Elizabeth lavished monopolies with a munificent hand until all trade and commerce, whether foreign or domestic, was appropriated by monopolists. Industry and the arts languished alike under these natural restraints and fictitious embarrassments. Media and tech scholar Tim Wu, who writes a lot about this and has a great book called The Curse of Bigness that I highly recommend, is very short, it's worth reading, writes that what not everyone remembers is that the American Revolution in some ways had been foreshadowed by the revolt against Charles I, and that abuse of monopoly by the Crown was one of its great sparks. Those early concerns then, the values and ideas and beliefs they felt they were protecting were the freedom to choose who to trade with and what line of work you want to go into yourself, that restraint of commerce was a bad thing for everyone, particularly when backed up by law, and that monarchical authority in restraint of trade was an unjustified abuse of power. But there is a difference worth pointing out too, that these monopolies were granted by the state, by the monarch. They weren't capitalist enterprises per se that had grown up without the state granting them an exclusivity license. The first corporate monopolies were different. We've looked at the history of how these corporations grew up and came about, the history of capitalism in the last video, so I don't want to revisit that again. It should be enough here just to say that by the end of the 19th century, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, giant national conglomerates or trusts dominated their industries in oil, meatpacking, railways, coal, tobacco, lead and steel, sugar, piping, even biscuits, led by the so-called robber barons, although to some historians robber barons is a controversial term. The more efficient businesses bought out, swallowed up, or outperformed their less efficient competitors. These capitalist giants were genuinely new phenomena in history, and they controlled anywhere between 40% of the market in, say, biscuits, to 90% in oil, to 98% in sugar. The end of the 19th century saw a spate of mergers in this direction. One historian estimates that over 2,000 companies merged into just 157 corporations. This is the meaning of that Charles Geist quote that I quoted at the beginning, that the history of capitalism has been unrelenting towards consolidation, that the history of capitalism has already merged into something new, that corporatism is a kind of bureaucratic, collectivistic, bolstered by stocks and shares and financial institutions. It's a system, it's an ideology that differs quite significantly from the kind of 19th century capitalism that capitalism grew up under, the individualistic capitalism. I've quoted this before, I'll quote it again. Hobsbawm has a great line on this where he says, across the 19th century, the invisible hand of Adam Smith's markets, where you have different prices and trades and ideas and businesses and costs and transport, logistics, manufacture, all balancing out, across an entire nation in a way that seems like an equilibrium is sustained through a balancing invisible hand, that if you charge too much in one area, then your competitor and hundreds others notice and charge less and draw attention, that kind of thing. That kind of invisible hand turned into a very visible structure of bureaucratic management, of planning, of these big legally construed corporate institutions in which layers of managers and business meetings between
CEOs and bank managers and investment bankers all determined the direction of investment or the costs or the deals that were happening explicitly. That invisible process that was happening across the market kind of condensed and moved into boardrooms, written out with pens, put into spreadsheets, moved through bureaucracies and governments. It became a different way of thinking about capitalism, about the economy, that I still don't think we fully, not understand, but fully have acknowledged that these are two very different systems. You know, maybe they have similar principles underneath them, motivating them, sustaining them, legitimating them, justifying them, that they have shared principles in the seeking of profit and investment in primarily private hands. But you have to lay out the differences, because only then can you understand how something works and what direction they might be going in.
The central reason this consolidation happened was that it was, and usually is, cheaper to produce products at scale than it is to have lots of different companies producing a similar product independently. So big business went about consolidating in two ways, what's called horizontally and vertically. So horizontal means buying companies similar to yours and integrating them into your manufacturing capacity and supply lines and so on. While vertical integration means buying companies that you use or are reliant on.
Take railroads. The American railroad magnate James Hill, who's mentioned in The Great Gatsby, was known as the empire builder of America. He's someone that acquired land and mines and transport and even banks to vertically integrate them into his business. All of the great railroad tycoons bought up other railroads. Rockefeller bought up mines for his oil refining empire. So whether it's sugar or oil or many other commodities in between, the premise of economies of scale is quite simple. And it is a kind of logic that it's much more efficient to have one system, unified, farming, growing, shipping, transport, refining, packaging, distribution, than it is to have hundreds separately across the country. So as one business gets bigger, its product gets cheaper, making it more profitable for competitors to sell out to them than it is to continue operating. And again, this is something that happened all across America in the late 19th century.
So far, so good, right? Cheaper products are better for everyone. Well, there were four main issues the early critics pointed to that the trusts had. And I've kind of categorised these loosely myself from the reading. People might disagree, but I think they capture similarities between each one, but I think we have to think about the differences between each critique as well. They were price fixing, influence, autocracy, and controlling labour. Now, the first, price fixing, was the observation that while prices may have been cheaper from consolidation at first, once the competition was wiped out, there was nothing to stop the raising of prices. The second critique, influence, was that these robber barons had outsized influence through lobbying and bribery to shape contracts and legislation in their favour. The third criticism, autocracy, was a fear inherited from the earlier critique of monopolies, that like monarchs granting exclusivity, one corporation in any industry looked a little bit too much like a monarch, like autocracy. And finally, they often aggressively banned or punished unions and blocked workers from leaving jobs to work with competitors, and so on.
The first muckrakers because they slung muck in newspapers, pointed fingers, people like Ida Tarbell, who saw firsthand what Standard Oil had done to her community with hostile takeovers and buying out smaller family-run businesses, the pain, the poverty that she saw that it caused. She described them as dictators and tyrannists. The Economist magazine used similar language when it described the antics of Fisk and Gould at the Erie train line headquarters. They said they are absolute dictators, neither rendering accounts, permitting discussion, nor regarding any interest but their own.
It's really crucial to get these criticisms right, to organise them and think about them clearly, so that later on we can see if they still apply today. So to do that, I think it might be useful to look at one of the first real populist movements in the world. They were known as the Grangers in America, and they protested that the railroad monopolists were pushing up the costs to farmers when using the railways.
The Grangers were a group of American farmers who organised as a protest against railroad costs in the 1860s and 1870s. They were immediately successful, with a peak of 700,000 members, organised into 21,000 of what they called lodges across the country. And what they were protesting against was that because there was only often one railroad company serving hundreds or thousands maybe of farms in a single limited geographical area, the railroads could push up the prices they charged as they wished because the farmers had nowhere else to go. Or they could use discriminatory pricing to get their way, to move the needle, to force someone out of business and to give preference to someone that supports you. Quid pro quo. This is one of the questions we'll get to. When does this become good business practice, the natural thing to do, what anyone would do? And when does it become something else? When does it become bribery? When does it become using your power unfairly to dominate an industry?
One of the difficulties in histories like this is often evidence from private companies is purposefully not written down, hidden, done verbally rather than contractually. So there's a lot of interpretation. Whereas if you're looking at the history of governments, especially more recent governments, there's a lot that has to be disclosed. You can go to National Archives. If you go to the archive of JP Morgan, I think they're going to be less willing to let you in. So historians draw on different types of evidence to try and understand this period. But I think the evidence that was made public during hearings is quite compelling. At one meeting, for example, in 1860, one person said, it costs 19 cents to carry a bushel of wheat from Chicago to New York. In 1873, that's 13 years later, it cost 37 cents, nearly double. Why? There are now more railroads to carry the produce and more produce to be carried than in 1860. The reason is there is more robbery. Another argued that grain purchasers and railroad companies colluded, saying there is little or no competition between rival buyers because they each agree each morning to pay a certain fixed price that day or else agree not to outbid each other and then divide their profits in proportion to the amount each man has bought. Another politician in a hearing pointed to how the Beef Trust fixes arbitrarily the daily price of cattle from which there is no appeal, for there is no other market. Another said that the sugar trusts were created for the purpose of controlling or curtailing the production or the supply so that they could increase the price to the people of the country. So I think when there's one or two corporations servicing in entire industry who have no choice but to use your service, like a train line, like a beef packing trust, like a sugar refining trust, then there is an incentive, probably a powerful one, to nudge the prices up as much as possible. And then there's no countervailing incentive or force on the other side, no price signals from competitors, no recourse from the farmers selling the sugarcane or the beef or trying to get their product onto the railway. So together, this is the price fixing critique.
But this wasn't the only complaint. Outright bribery was common too. Cornelius Vanderbilt's son, and the Vanderbilts, if you don't know, were the first national railroad magnates in America, he said, "When I want to buy up any politician, I always find the anti-monopolists to be the most purchasable. They don't come so high." And in building Standard Oil, Rockefeller aggressively lobbied, funded and bribed politicians, senators, anyone he needed to. Railroad man Jay Gould bribed public officials, including Ulysses S. Grant's brother-in-law, to help manipulate the gold markets in his favour. And they would all often threaten competitors and bribe them in return for not competing with them. In one hearing, steamship lines admitted that they paid Vanderbilt $500,000 per year in return for not competing with them. That's all they could do.
Finally, there was the controlling of labour. Unions were often, if not always, I can't quite remember when they were legalised, but at least often banned in this period. There was also the problem of monopsony. Not monopoly, monopsony. So if monopoly means when there's only one seller of something, a monopsony is when there's only one buyer of something, or just a handful of buyers of something controlling the market. And in this case, we're talking about buyers of labour. In other words, the employer. The employer has a monopoly on the hiring of labour, and the fewer businesses in control of a market, the more they can, for example, push down wages. Things like non-compete agreements, naked threats, collusion with other business owners to punish so-called troublemakers or whistleblowers. All of these things can be used to control the labour market.
There is, of course, a longer, more detailed, more in-depth story to be told here. One that includes the often very violent conflict between unions and workers and businesses and bosses and strike breakers. I looked at some of that in the last video, but for the purposes of this subject, you can just take, for example, what the Minnesota Iron Company had as a policy in 1884. It read, "No person belonging to any combination or union to control wages," and they use that language specifically, control, "or regulate time or manner of service will be employed. And any employee entering such combination or union or endeavouring to control wages will be discharged promptly and finally, and will forfeit all money earned by him at the time of such discharge." Whether that language, that a union was intended to control wages, whether it was being used as a weapon pointedly, or whether it was what was genuinely believed by capitalists, that unions were this unnatural force with the intention of naturally manipulating and controlling wages. Which one it is, I'm not sure. It probably depends, again, on the period and the person and the business. Someone like Andrew Carnegie, who famously put down that Homestead strike, was reportedly felt very bad about it later on and changed his mind somewhat, but this was a widespread belief at the time that unions were there to control wages, were there to do something unnatural, were unjust and unfair.
So autocracy, price fixing, bribery, lobbying, controlling workers, banning unions, these were all seen to be common practices towards the end of the century. Some of this was tolerated by the American public and politicians if the benefits were clear. But several crashes towards the end of the century convinced Americans that they needed to do something about it. Some have called the last few decades of the 19th century the Long Depression. Two of the biggest railroad companies failed in 1873, leading to a national market crash. There were others in 1896 and 1907. The failure of J. Cook's Railroad, the historian Geist, who we talked about earlier, said caused 1873, which he said was another crash in the long history of financial downturns precipitated by the robber barons and financiers. So, in short, by this period, economic inequality was perceived to be getting out of control.
The Grangers and the farmer movements were the first to organise and push for some kind of legislation. In 1873, and bear in mind that's 17 years before the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Farmers' Anti-Monopoly Convention met and declared the principles that, quote, all corporations are subject to legislative control, and that such legislative control should be an express abrogation of the theory of the inalienable nature of chartered rights. Now that sounds a bit complicated, but it essentially means that corporations shouldn't have inalienable rights in the same way that humans and people do. It continued that it should be at all times so used as to prevent moneyed corporations from becoming engines of oppression. We should bear in mind here, and it is interesting, that this is a kind of multi-decade, generational story. I think that has some parallels with today. But Iowa was the first state in the world to pass antitrust laws in 1888. They made it illegal to, quote, regulate or fix the price of oil, lumber, coal, grain, flour, provision, or any other commodity or article whatever, or to, quote, fix or limit the amount or quantity of goods. It's also interesting, and this will come up again, that they had to include a list of commodities in the law, but then say any other commodity or article whatever. There's an issue of imprecision here that we'll get back to.
Senator John Sherman had been a lawyer and was the main author of the federal bill that passed 2 years later in 1890. Sherman was a great articulator of the reasoning for passing the antitrust legislation.
He said that no social problem is, quote, more threatening than the inequality of condition, of wealth and opportunity that has grown within a single generation out of the concentration of capital into vast combinations to control production and trade and to break down competition. And he said in another speech that legislation shouldn't be designed to stifle free enterprise, but instead to prevent and control combinations made with a view to prevent competition or for the restraint of trade or to increase the profits of the producer at the cost of the consumer.
The key insight or argument was that the breaking up or the preventing of monopoly power in the first place wasn't the suppression or control of free enterprise. It was the very opposite. It was the facilitator. It was the promotion, the promoter, the protector of free enterprise.
Section 1 of the proposed Sherman Act read, quote, every contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in restraint of trade or commerce among the several states or with foreign nations is hereby declared to be illegal. And Section 2 read, every person who shall monopolise or attempt to monopolise or combine or conspire with any other person or persons to monopolise any part of the trade or commerce among the several states or with foreign nations shall be deemed guilty of a misdemeanour.
The vague language raises some obvious and difficult questions. What counts as restraint of trade when you could argue that everything a company does is an attempt to beat the competition, is an attempt to restrain trade? Restraint, contract, combination, these are key words here that are pored over and interpreted by lawyers. Every successful contract, say, that makes your company better than the competition, that at least does certain things that are what's called exclusionary, could be seen as a restraint on trade. And every acquisition of a competitor, no matter the reason, could be seen as a restraint on trade.
The broad philosophy then, the idea, was easier than the details of where the line is, what the definitions are, how to draw them, how to think of them, though that is often the case with the law. The philosophy, Sherman said famously, was that if we will not endure a king as a political power, we should not endure a king over the production, transportation and sale of any of the necessities of life. If we would not submit to an emperor, we should not submit to an autocrat of trade with power to prevent competition and to fix the price of any commodity. In an interesting example of a cross-party consensus that something needed to be done, the Sherman Bill passed the House unanimously, which must be a one-off for such a seemingly consequential piece of legislation, I'm not sure, and it passed the Senate 51-1.
But because of those ambiguities, the difficulties in defining it, the imprecise language, the Sherman Act wasn't acted upon for years. In one case, for example, 5 years after it passed in 1890, so in 1895, the Supreme Court rejected the government's attempt to stop the American Sugar Refining Company buying out 4 smaller companies, which after it went through, gave the company a 98% share of the market.
President McKinley's administration from 1897 to 1901 was a laissez-faire one. Wu points out that the philosophy, quote, suggested that economic problems would tend to work themselves out, and hence government intervention would usually do more harm than good.
The banker J.P. Morgan created the Steel Trust in this period. President McKinley didn't attempt to block the deal. He did, though, instead hold a dinner hosting and in honour of Morgan, who was seen as the American government's banker. And this points to a problem we'll explore a bit more shortly. You can legislate as much as you want, but what happens when a small number of CEOs and politicians go out to dinner together? How can you protect against that kind of unofficial influence? How can you possibly ever know what, say, Morgan and McKinley told each other or promised each other, a gentleman's agreement over the dinner table in the White House behind closed doors? So this is a problem, and it also points to how legislation alone isn't enough. You need more. You need a Supreme Court, a president, a Department of Justice, and a media, political and social culture willing to agitate for, to defend it, and to enforce it.
When Teddy Roosevelt replaced McKinley in 1901, this began to happen. Over 2 terms, Roosevelt's government broke up or blocked over 40 different trusts, including beef and tobacco. The big one was in 1911 when Standard Oil was broken up. Rockefeller's giant trust owned 67 smaller businesses, including piping, marketing, refining, and transport. Public attention was galvanized particularly by the journalist Ida Tarbell's influential series of articles, then turned into a book called The History of the Standard Oil Company, which included copies of exchanges between Rockefeller and smaller producers, with Rockefeller warning that if you refuse to sell, it will end in your being crushed. Tarbell also went across the country looking for documents that Rockefeller wanted destroyed and found them hidden in some copy of a book in some dusty library. It really turned the tide of popular opinion against him. When Standard Oil was broken up into several smaller oil companies, prices then decreased and innovation improved. Like Sherman, Roosevelt was an articulate defender of the antitrust position. He said that, quote, "A resolute and practical effort must be made to correct these evils," and he said, "It's no limitation upon property rights or freedom of contract to require that when men receive from government the privilege of doing business under corporate form, it frees them from individual responsibility and enables them to call into their enterprises the capital of the public." He continued that great corporations exist only because they are created and safeguarded by our institutions, and it's therefore our right and our duty to see that they work in harmony with these institutions. Another of the most influential thinkers of this period was the Supreme Court Justice, or Assistant Supreme Court Justice, I can't quite remember now, Louis Brandeis, who coined the term the curse of bigness. He saw capitalism as working best as he'd seen it in his small idyllic hometown of Louisville, where he saw small businesses competing with each other in a fair and friendly way, small stores in the community balancing each other out. There were no big factories or corporations dominating and controlling, and business owners and the rest of the community, the education board, for example, came together democratically, face to face, worked everything out. In 1911, Brandeis wrote that we are in a position, after the experience of the last 20 years, to state two things. In the first place, that a corporation may well be too large to be the most efficient instrument of production and distribution, and in the second place, whether it has exceeded the point of greatest economic efficiency or not, it may be too large to be tolerated among the people who desire to be free. But the difficulty in interpreting the philosophy remained. In 1914, the Clayton Act was passed, which aimed to clarify some of the details and prohibit certain practices adjacent to the initial antitrust law. Robber barons, for example, had used discriminatory pricing to control the market. Rockefeller struck deals that meant that competitors would pay the railroads more for the transport of their goods than someone like Rockefeller's. This type of price discrimination was banned. Exclusivity contracts that would lessen the competition, that were exclusionary rather than competitive in practice, that would push the competition out, they were prohibited. I don't know, an example of this might be, you can only have my product in your store if you don't have any of my competitors' products on the shelf. This would be seen, I think, as exclusionary. Also, being a director of two or more competing corporations was prohibited. It also outlined some thresholds at which the FTC would have to be notified of mergers and acquisitions. So the lesson of the Clayton Act, and many subsequent smaller acts like it since, is that the philosophy is one thing, the broad philosophy, but the devil is in the details. And a whole body of antitrust law slowly gets built up around an initial philosophy. I think it might be useful at this juncture to reflect on what we're trying to do here. It's referred to as applied history. We're trying to use the past, use history to illuminate the present in some way. But history doesn't repeat, at least never precisely, never exactly, never in a one-to-one way. So history can't provide perfect lessons, a perfect model. But it does help us orient ourselves, gives us some perspective, gives us models or possible models of action. It shows us how we got to where we are and where we might be going. In many ways, applied history is about reasons, risks, and results.
We look at the reasons people did things in the past. We look at the results, whether it worked or it didn't. And we assess the risks of acting or not acting. We'll return to this idea in a bit, but I think this model of applied history is one of the reasons for Godwin's law, a law which I'm guilty of breaking often, or proving often, sorry, not breaking often. It's a law that I prove. I wonder how many videos, 80% of them. The law is that given enough time on the internet, someone inevitably brings up Hitler. But when you look at applied history and you think about Godwin's law, it's because fascism is a marker for what many see as the biggest risk of all. Why did fascism emerge? What were the reasons? What were the factors? What were the warning signs? What can we learn from it today? What path do we not want to go down? It's the ultimate applied history marker, but it has to be approached carefully, and you have to try to not be alarmist about it. Only use it as a kind of cautionary model, point to a few similarities, but maybe not go around calling everyone a fascist or Hitler all the time.
Fascism and totalitarianism were, or are, in many ways, philosophies or the politics of the big. They require strong men because our infrastructure, financial institutions, corporations, weapons, steel production, military, the state, surveillance networks, you name it, had, by the 20th century, grown to these enormous historic sizes. Many people look to the crisis of liberal democracy, the crisis of capitalism in the 30s. The Sherman Act didn't stop this trend towards bigness in America. Steel is the paradigmatic example. Demand obviously continued growing in building, skyscrapers got taller, railways got longer and stronger, bridges got longer, taller, stronger, weapons got more powerful, stronger war machines, tanks, planes, ships, the Titanic, household appliances got better, quicker, bigger in many cases, if not individually, than the factory supply lines that manufactured them. So it was in the 20th century that all of this really took off. And as demand grew, it got cheaper to manufacture steel per ton at scale in a unified network.
This is why a person as true-blooded capitalist American as the banker J.P. Morgan, along with quite a few others of the period, came to believe in the virtue of some kind of centralised planning. He thought competition was ruinous. Here's one of the contradictions of modernity then. The contradictions of the logic, the process of modernity. First, people become freer to pursue their own interests, build their own small businesses. Then things get bigger. We or they produce more and more. Individual businesses come into competition with each other. Those businesses then consolidate and concentrate, and we end up having bigger enterprises and fewer people in charge of them. What happens politically then, when rather than hundreds of business owners spread out across a geographical area, there are a handful of them in capital cities, for example? You get a small class of business owners and politicians who all know each other, who all have similar interests, thinking in the same way. You get an oligarchy.
This was increasingly the case in the early 20th century. In the US, business leaders dined at the White House. In Russia, the entire economy became under the control of a few in Moscow. And in trying to catch up with Britain and America, Germany and Japan both took a more top-down approach to advancing their economies to catch up with Britain and America. In Germany, giant cartels like Siemens in electronics and IG Farben in chemicals dominated, as well as in steel and armaments.
These were known as the German rationalizations, and intellectuals in Germany saw them as more civilized than the individualistic, chaotic approach in somewhere like Britain or America, because they were rational and controlled and ordered and directed and planned from the centre, rather than chaotic, competitive, unwieldy, Wild West, scrappy little enterprises.
One German economist of the period, Gustav Schmoller, wrote that the rationalizations, quote, represented a progressive stage in the order of national economy, progress which would inevitably lead to a more highly organised form of the national economy. The rationalizations were seen as civilized, as ordered, as planned, as modern, rather than unwieldy and chaotic. Then, in the 1930s, the Great Depression hit Germany, and there's a broad consensus among economists that the highly concentrated German economy made the Depression worse. By their large, static, immovable nature, the cartels were rigid and unable to respond by adjusting things like production levels or experimenting and innovating with different techniques or simply adjusting prices. And even more consequential for German history, the highly concentrated economy made it much easier for Hitler to consolidate power for himself and the Nazis. He also believed that a strong economy required a strong central command, a so-called capitalist planned economy. It's really fascinating here to see a convergence of ideas between as different figures as J.P. Morgan, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. That's not to say they're all the same, obviously. It's to say that this idea that the economy needed planning, needed commanding, that competition could be ruinous, was quite clearly in the global zeitgeist. As one German historian writes, quote, Germany's cartels and monopolies proved agile and dangerous pacemakers for the transformation of a free market into an authoritarian market. Instead of being spread out with different views and values and perspectives, different incentives, different checks and balances on one another, different calculations, different thoughts, living in different regions with different communities and peoples, the Nazi leadership and the cartel leadership were condensed into a tight oligopoly. As Wu writes, as the Nazi Party tottered in 1932, the industrialists, previously divided and moderate, offered major financial support to the Nazis in their hour of greatest need. This was manifested by the circle of friends becoming the main financial backers of the Nazi Party. In fact, the chemical giant IG Farben contributed 4.5 million Reichsmarks to the Nazi Party and profited from labour at Auschwitz, producing rubber and even operating a concentration camp of its own, and most infamously manufacturing the gas used in the Holocaust. US Senator Harley Kilgore summarised matters in 1944, saying, Germany built up a great series of industrial monopolies in steel, rubber, coal and other materials. The monopolies soon got control of Germany, brought Hitler to power and forced virtually the whole world into war. The story was similar in Japan. What were called the Zaibatsu were essentially national cartels run by powerful families with long-standing dynastic heritage. The Zaibatsu dominated Japanese economic life, but also political life. They controlled businesses and banking and sponsored their own political parties. So unlike the West, Japan had less of a neat line between business and politics, between public and private. In one influential study after the war, the economist Corin Edwards published an influential study concluding that the Zaibatsu were among, quote, the groups principally responsible for the war and the principal factor in the Japanese war potential.
Like Brandeis, who believed that the size of government and the size of business were equally threatening, in Germany, a group called the Ordo Liberals made similar warnings as the Nazi Party were coming to power.
In 1947, leading Ordo Liberal Franz Bohm wrote, "Power concentration within the market will always create potential for war. It matters not whether the command system is National Socialist, Socialist, or Communist in character. What's decisive is the fact that each command system owns an extraordinarily extensive power apparatus which can be centrally deployed and mastered by a very small number of people, that individual positions of power are necessarily apportioned within oligopolistic procedures that can neither be overseen nor vetoed by the public."
So in the aftermath of World War II, the Allies broke up German corporations and the Japanese Zaibatsu. 42 Japanese companies were dissolved entirely and 26 of them broken up into smaller businesses.
And in the 50s, the lesson of the war was well remembered. One senator, Estes Kefauver, speaking in 1950, said that, "I think we must decide very quickly what sort of country we want to live in. I'm not an alarmist, but the history of what has taken place in other nations where mergers and concentrations have placed economic control in the hands of a very few people is too clear to pass over easily." And conservatives were as fearful as liberals. Take this quote from the conservative economist George Stigler in 1952. He wrote that the dissolution of big businesses is necessary to increase the support for a private, competitive enterprise economy and to reverse the drift toward government control.
I think Kefauver puts it well. The point of fascism as analogy is not to be sensationalist, not to be alarmist. It's not to go around calling everything we don't like fascist and Hitler, but simply to use history as a guide to what could happen, to keep it in our memory, in our thought patterns, to think about why it happened, to construct as thorough a narrative as possible about where we've been, what the risks are, and what we might do about similarities in the present. The comparisons with Japan and Germany get even more interesting in the post-war period. Picture the world economy and the advances technologically of the period. West Germany, and the West more broadly, continued growing quicker than the more centrally commanded East Germany and USSR and the satellite states. But a more interesting analogy appears when you compare tech companies in the US of the period with tech in Japan and what happens after.
AT&T, the American communications giant, was the biggest company in the world. It employed over 1 million people and was created by none other than J.P. Morgan. Importantly, it controlled telephone services, telegraphy, the network, plus the hardware, the installation, most of the phones and equipment, and it was very close to the US government and military, working on nuclear warning systems and things like missiles. In other words, it was at the forefront of innovation and technology. In computing, IBM had a similar monopoly. In those days, you would buy a computer packaged with both IBM hardware and IBM software, just as AT&T sold you line rental and the actual telephone hardware. It was all done by one company. Across the Pacific, with a newly decentralized liberal economy, Japan was surprising everyone by quickly catching up with the West. They had big companies like Sony, Fujitsu, Sega and Nintendo, and many in the US saw not Europe, not Canada, not the USSR, but Japan as their biggest competitor.
This is where things get contradictorily interesting. What's the intuitive thing to do in this scenario. Think about it. You have the best tech companies in the world in your country, more successful than any company in history. Surely, the intuitive thing to do is to support your innovators, your business leaders, the ones innovating and bringing profit into the country. Make sure they have everything they need. Give them all of the power you can. But the US did exactly the opposite. Drawing on that anti-monopoly Magna Carta, cases were brought against IBM throughout the period, and then AT&T was broken up into smaller companies in the 80s.
During the IBM trial, the company spent up to $1 million on their defence, and it lasted for years. One legal journalist writing in 1982 said that it was a farce of such mind-boggling proportions that any lawyer who now tries to find out about it will be risking the same quicksand that devoured the lawyers involved in the case. Another, I can't remember who now, said it was the Antitrust Department's Vietnam. But at the same time, Japan did the opposite. It wanted to be the first country to build a giant supercomputer. So what better thing to do than support your big, innovative, leading companies? Why wouldn't you? They'd made Walkman, Space Invaders, Pac-Man, Sony. They'd made huge developments. So in the 1980s, that's exactly what they did.
But this was the one thing that no one really saw coming. It wasn't a few supercomputers that were going to change the world, but smaller personal computers. Innovation wasn't coming from those big, slow, institutional, mono-thinking giants, but from scrappy startups like Microsoft and Apple in garages in Silicon Valley.
What happened next? The US had another further tech revolution, while Japan started to fall behind. Compared with Silicon Valley, no new big innovative Japanese tech firms came out of the 90s or noughties. So counterintuitively, not supporting the giant, dominant, seemingly technologically advanced players is the way to get innovation coming from outside of them, from other people. The big players are often both cumbersome and bureaucratic and focused on what they already do.
There may be some larger company that has some distribution advantage, but I don't know, large companies are slow and they lack conviction.
The same happened with Microsoft after it grew into the giant it is today. Bill Gates didn't believe in the internet at first, for example. He thought it would likely come through televisions because people would want to be sat in the lounge watching the internet in comfort. He didn't think people would be at their computers on the internet. So instead, innovation came from outside the dominant player, from AOL or Netscape. AT&T could have even dominated the internet industry, as it had a monopoly on things like long-distance wires and hardware. It had everything to connect people. It even tried to crush rivals like MCI, who were trying to innovate with microwave long-distance services. When AT&T was broken up, phone rates fell by 40%.
Which gets us to today. In particular, the focus on big tech and those conglomerates that we looked at the beginning. The point of applying history in this way is, I think, to do two things. To remember first that history doesn't repeat exactly. So there are no immutable, repeatable, one-to-one lessons from history. But we have to simultaneously remember that history is one of the only real reference points that we have. We should use it then as analogy. We should use it as rough guide. What might happen? What were the results when it happened before? What are the risks of not acting? What's the same and what's changed? It's useful to have a loose list of concepts from history that we've learnt and think about how they relate to each other to generalize, to get a general sense, and then to keep that in mind when we apply them to present problems. This is the big one. Price fixing, conspiracy, cartels, attempts to monopolize the market, the industry, certain types of non-compete agreements, etc., etc. In the US, the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, looks on all of these things as mostly exclusionary, as rigging the market, as stopping there being a fair market where people can compete on fair terms. And the big fear here is the artificial inflation of prices. The most obvious place this happens is when a company becomes so dominant, it can push up the prices of their products to extract more profit without the fear of a competitor lowering their prices to compete.
Study after study have shown how prices are pushed up after consolidation. Prices for televisions, for example, have increased by more than inflation for every year for the past 20 years. Or take that sunglasses manufacturer we looked at, Luxottica. Sunglasses can now be made for a few dollars, and so the margin on them is often more than 5,000%. Take one example of how this is sustained. In 2007, the brand Oakley's tried to drop the prices of their sunglasses to compete with Luxottica. Luxottica responded by taking Oakley's out of their stores, which devalued Oakley's, and then Luxottica bought Oakley's in a very hostile takeover. Or take another study that was used in court. It showed that having a Wild Oats store in the vicinity of a Whole Foods store caused prices to drop. Then, of course, Whole Foods bought out Wild Oats, prices go up.
Then there's lobbying, bribing, using market power to skew contracts or regulations. This was the original critique inherited from the monarchical monopoly at the beginning, and it was part of Sherman's complaint that if we won't accept a king in the political realm, then we shouldn't accept one in the economic. The risk here is on an axis between democracy on the one hand and oligarchy or autocracy or authoritarianism or too much control, whatever you want to call it, on the other hand. And it's the question of, do we want to live in a society where concentration moves more and more towards a small group with disproportionate power? Is that democratic? And the big risk analogy here is Japan and Germany in the 30s, but we might also look at China today, tightly controlled, so-called everything apps like WeChat that do, messaging and banking and shopping all in one. Apps that not only capture lots of data, but also has a very tight relationship with the state, and a state at that that's known for dystopian surveillance.
As Walter Bennett wrote, nothing provides a finer weapon for the budding dictator than a concentration of economic power which he can take over at the top.
Then there's the effect that monopolisation has on work and wages, things like union busting or punitive terms and contracts with employees or the downward pressure on wages. All these things are more common when there are fewer companies to sell your labour to. This was the monopsony issue we looked at earlier.
And this isn't just academic. To take one example, in 2006, nurses sued hospitals in America who had violated antitrust laws by depressing nurses' wages by a secret agreement. Apple and Google have been long accused of having anti-poaching agreements. Non-compete agreements are of course common.
This is difficult to measure, but I think the evidence is pretty strong that innovation tends to come, not always, but very often tends to come from individuals and smaller companies and startups. When AT&T was broken up, the phone network and the tech sector didn't suffer. If anything, there was innovation. The same applied to the sector when IBM was going through its antitrust case. And this was also the comparison with Japanese companies we looked at. Microsoft has a history of buying, copying, or excluding competitors' products. After Standard Oil was broken up, because the smaller companies had to compete, there were innovations in things like surveying, drilling, and transport. Now, there is a counterpoint to this in that sometimes very big companies have lots of capital and are so able to invest in innovation in ways that smaller companies can't. The big example of this is AT&T's Bell Labs. There was a whole string of innovations so impactful that they won many Nobel Prizes. But it's also hard to run the counterfactual there because you don't know what would have happened if AT&T wasn't so dominant, wasn't such a big force in the industry and for innovation. In other words, of course it was going to be the place where innovation happened because it was the only player in the game. And I think the big point against this today would be ChatGPT. It wasn't a small, scrappy startup, but the innovation in large language models and AI didn't come from the incumbent big tech companies like Google. It came from a smaller startup.
Finally, we have to acknowledge the benefits of being big. Theoretically, buying out smaller companies is profitable for both the bigger and the smaller company because of economies of scale, which should then make the products cheaper for all of us. Of course, this does happen. There are also network effects, which are a positive. They apply to both train lines, for example, and Facebook, to take another example. A network effect means that the more people that are connected, the bigger the network becomes, the better it is, and the higher the costs of leaving it are. In other words, some things are better when they're bigger.
Finally, we use the past to look at solutions, approaches, plus how they've changed. And we have to remember that each new generation approaches the subject, the philosophy, the law, the ideas in new ways as the conditions change, as the technology and industry and politics and culture and ideas and science changes.
The issues with Meta, say, are not the same as the problems with Standard Oil, although there might be some crossover. And there's the issue that as new regulations are passed over the course of over a century now, because of changing conditions, the law might become over-regulated in different areas and also become too generalised. In other words, certain regulations passed to address issues with Standard Oil might then apply generally across all antitrust cases, but prohibit a tech company from doing something that is warranted or is not as much of a problem as when Standard Oil did it, because the conditions are different, because they have different practices, different goals, different effects. In short, though, some of the solutions are stopping mergers in the first place, and then you have to ask what percentage share of the market do you have to exceed for continued mergers to be a problem. There's breaking up companies, which has only historically been used in the last resort. Then there's consent decrees, where a company has to oblige by certain standards, like the one Microsoft had to agree to, which was an agreement that instead of breaking Microsoft up, it was required to play by certain rules, like not forcing competitors to package Internet Explorer with Windows. Then there are specific laws and regulations prohibiting certain practices, price fixing, exclusionary practices, non-compete practices, and so on. The global economic landscape today is, or at least seems in many ways, even more concentrated than it was in the 19th century. The biggest question, if I've convinced you that you should be concerned about these things, is how concentrated should a market be able to get? In many industries, from search engines to microprocessors, even to shopping malls, over and over, 3 to 4 companies have 95% plus market share. In some cases, that's 1 or 2. On the other hand, that doesn't mean they're monopolies if each only has a 25% share. Take something like toilet roll. It's an industry that's dominated by a handful of companies. It's literally rolled out on huge production lines. It benefits massively from economies of scale. There's not much room for innovation with toilet paper. So as long as there's some competition between the companies that stops us paying big bucks per wipe, then that's all good, right? You have a handful of companies, they're efficient, and each of them keeps a lid on the others' inflating prices. So let's look at the elephant in the room, big tech. There are several antitrust suits against Google, Meta, and Apple going through the US courts right now. A judge recently ruled that Google had violated the Sherman Act and had a monopoly in search. The ruling argued that contracts with Apple and phone manufacturers to make Google search default on their devices was, quote, exclusionary, with the judge saying that the prospect of losing tens of billions in guaranteed revenue from Google, which presently come at little to no cost to Apple, disincentivizes Apple from launching its own search engine when it otherwise has built the capacity to do so. In other words, Google pays Apple $20 billion per year to have Google search as their default. The Department of Justice in the US argues that Google uses, quote, the power of defaults to maintain a monopoly anti-competitively. Also, Google Ads executive Jerry Deichler has admitted that Google hiked up ad prices quietly. And we often forget in these kinds of cases that monopolies are often about prices, and these big social media platforms and big tech companies are a bit different in that we don't actually pay to use them. Of course, the customer is the advertiser, but you can look there at how consolidation might artificially push up the price of advertising online in general. Importantly, under US law, it's not illegal to have a monopoly, only to obtain or maintain one illegally. As Lauren Feiner at The Verge writes, the Department of Justice argued that Google illegally monopolised the general search advertising market by effectively cutting off key distribution channels for rivals through exclusionary contracts. And Meta, Facebook's parent company, has been accused by the FTC of buying Instagram and WhatsApp to, quote, engage in a systemic strategy to eliminate threats to its monopoly. Facebook saw the fast-growing Instagram as a direct competitor, a future threat. When it bought Instagram in 2012 for $1 billion, Instagram had around 30 million users. Facebook had approaching 1 billion, but Instagram was growing at 1 million users per day, and as TechCrunch reported at the time, was on track to surpass Facebook. Regulators in the UK decided it was fine because they weren't direct competitors, as Facebook wasn't a photo-taking app. WhatsApp was similarly purchased by Facebook for similar reasons for $19 billion. One of the issues antitrust law has to deal with is market concentration and how it's measured. There are no hard and fast rules, but they use measures like HHI to work this out. And a rule of thumb is that after some equations and some measurements and working out what is and isn't included in an industry, a 50% market share equals a highly concentrated market that should more likely be scrutinised. Another issue is how you classify industries. What counts as a social media platform, for example? Do you include Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, Reddit, and Twitter in the same category? Is WhatsApp fundamentally different? Or could it have become a social media platform that competes with Facebook later on, especially when it had acquired the user base to do so?
Much of this comes down to calculations of risk, reward, and imperfect, often, solutions. What size do you allow a company to get? What counts as exclusionary practices and what counts as fair? What counts as price fixing? How do you measure such a thing as the potential future effects on something as ambiguous as innovation? What kind of business meeting counts as a conspiracy?
In a 1963 case, the Supreme Court established an influential precedent that mergers resulting in a 30% market share were unlawful. If you were deciding whether to break up Meta into 3 separate companies, Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, then the case could quite easily be made that Meta exceeds that market share, and already did so when Facebook bought Instagram in 2012. And breaking up a company is not the only solution. Sure, you can go with DuckDuckGo instead of Google easily if you want to, but the Department of Justice's case is that Google's deal with Apple stops Apple from creating their own search engine, and that they're one of the only big companies that have the resources to do so. If that's exclusionary, then you can prohibit deals like that specifically, which is one of the things the prosecutors in this antitrust case want to happen. So the key to all of this is judging when the risk of not intervening is high enough, and when the potential rewards of intervening are also high enough to warrant the intervention. The question would be, what's the downside of breaking up a company like Meta? Even shareholders would benefit if the individual companies then went on to become more innovative. Even Mark Zuckerberg would benefit.
But we should also remember that big tech is a new phenomenon. The solutions that worked for Standard Oil or AT&T might not be suitable for something like a social media platform. With such a new technology, radically new thinking is also needed. But that's for another video.
As Wu writes, it's notable that the peak of anti-monopoly enforcement coincided with a period of extraordinary gains in prosperity in the industrialised world, and also gains in wealth and income equality.
Those ordo-liberals in Germany in the 1930s and 40s compared an ideal government to a gardener, cutting back plants that had become too overpowering, too overshadowing, too unwieldy, too damaging to other plants, weeding, tending to the garden, encouraging new flowers to grow.
Well, if you made it this far, then congratulations and thank you so much for watching this video. Videos like this take such a long time for me to prepare, from the research to the writing to the recording. The research in itself takes, at least a year really before in the last few months I really dive into it, but it takes a lot of exploratory research, understanding the literature, and it's just a small team. It's grown from me, who, as I said, does the reading and the research, the writing, the recording, and then Paul and Louis, who really masterfully put it all together to make it even more entertaining for you to watch. But it's a lot, and it takes a long time when the economics of YouTube incentivizes content that is a lot flashier, shorter, surface level, and so the competition is getting harder and harder. So if you want to support content like this, you can, and you can get something in return. You can get ad-free and early videos, you can get bonus videos, you can get access to my short course on how I think about history, how historians think about history, the debates that undergraduates and postgraduates learn about in an accessible way, and really ground your understanding of history, which I think is getting more and more important in this age of kind of increasingly democratizing information. You get access to scripts and updates about sources and what's coming up and all the rest of it. But yes, you get to support the channel too and get your name in the credits like all these incredible Patreon supporters are right now. It literally wouldn't happen without them. So I've left a link below. If you want to support for just $1 or $2, you can do that there. And you can come along to the Patreon and ask me questions, and you can give me feedback. And, you know, I'm always trying to improve, grow, get better at framing and understanding and telling these stories. So hopefully I'll see you over there. You know, if not, just like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, all the rest of it. Most of all, thank you so much. And I can't wait to see you again.